The year 2021 marks the 175th anniversary of the founding of St. Peter's. The first church was built on Washington Street between Wells and Franklin at a cost of $1,000 and dedicated on August 2nd, 1846. It was a frame building 40 feet wide and 60 feet long with a seating capacity of 700. Let me give you a brief history of Catholic life in Chicago before St. Peter's Church was built in 1846. In 1830, there were 100 white settlers in the area of Chicago. On occasional visits, missionaries took care of the spiritual needs of the Catholics. When Chicago was organized as a city in 1833, 38 of the 125 Catholics residing in the Chicago area sent a written petition to Bishop Joseph Rosati of St. Louis, who acted as the Vicar General for the Chicago area, to ask for a resident priest. The Reverend John Mary Aeneas St. Cyr, born in France, was ordained in St. Louis in 1833 and received his first appointment, quote, the mission of Chicago and the adjoining regions within the state of Illinois. What a gigantic task this must have been for such a very young priest. On May 5th, 1833, Father St. Cyr celebrated his first Sunday Mass in Chicago in a log cabin owned by Mary Beaubien on the west side of Market Street, now Wacker Drive. 5 months later, Chicago Catholics had their first church on the northwest corner of Lake and State Street. It was St. Mary's Church. Among the first worshipers were 300 Potawatomi Native Americans, 1,000 of whom were assembled at Chicago to sell the government their lands in Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. In those days, only 2 priests were in Chicago. The population grew to 8,000. Because of the rapid growth, Chicago was created as a diocese in 1843. The first bishop was Bishop William J. Quarter from New York, who in time was convinced of the necessity of 2 more churches, one north and another south of the Chicago River, to care for the spiritual needs of the German-speaking Catholics. The church south of the river became St. Peter's Church in 1846. The one north of the river became St. Joseph's Church. It has been 175 years since those humble beginnings. In those 175 years of parish life, St. Peter's has been an oasis of sacramental and spiritual renewal for countless millions of Catholics. Father John Jung was the first pastor of St. Peter's. He was the one who convinced the new first bishop of Chicago, Bishop William Quarter of New York, of the necessity of building 2 churches, one on the south side of the Chicago River, which became St. Peter's Church, and one on the north side of the river, which became St. Joseph Church. The first St. Peter's Church was dedicated on August the 2nd, 1846. Father Jung was also built a school and a rectory. In 1853, the new pastor, Father George Plath, saw the need of moving to another site because businesses and the railroads in the vicinity of St. Peter's were driving parishioners further south and west. Believe it or not, the original frame church was moved in 2 sections to a low and swampy lot on the southwest corner of Polk and Clark. On Christmas Day, 1854, the congregation attended the first Mass in the patched building. St. Peter's Church was growing in 1860, and there was need for a larger church. The new church was dedicated in 1865 at a cost of $32,359. The poor pastor, Father John Mager, who sustained so much worry and exertion in building the church, fell sick and died at the early age of 35 years old. Father Peter Fisher, who was building a new church in Naperville, was called in as pastor. In 1870, Chicago's population numbered more than 500,000. St. Peter's had grown into a parish of 1,200 families with 2 schools. Then came the disastrous Chicago fire. On a Sunday night October 8th, 1871, the church bells rang out in alarm. The life of the city was being swallowed up in devastating flames a mile wide and 4 miles long. Fanned by high winds and soaring and roaring through the tender dry frame buildings, the fire, which had started on the near west side, raced towards the lake. The flames leapt across the river at Polk Street and was but 2 blocks away from St. Peter's Church. The people of the parish hastened to the church in their last refuge and piled their pitifully few belongings on the steps and against the walls of the church, and they prayed. Father Fisher was already there on his knees, imploring help from heaven. His flock distinctly heard him promise to erect a church in honor of St. Anthony of Padua if God should spare his church and school. All of a sudden, the fire changed its course. The wind veered northwards, and St. Peter's Church, its school, and its people were spared. True to his promise, Father Fisher built the church 2 years later and instituted St. Anthony devotions every Tuesday in the parish, which has continued to this very day. Late that evening, a heavy rain put out the fire. 300 lives were lost and 17,500 buildings destroyed. Chicago's total loss was $190 million. 150 families of the parish were left homeless. A second fire occurred 3 years later, lasting 11 hours and reducing 650 homes on the near south side and causing a loss of almost $4 million. This fire destroyed more of the parishioners' homes, including many families, and inducing them to move further south to 24th Street. Within a half year of the Chicago fire in 1871, Bishop Thomas Foley, who himself had been burnt out of church and home, invited the Franciscans to take charge of St. Peter's in Chicago. On July 29, 1875, 5 Franciscans arrived at St. Peter's Church, 3 friar priests and 2 lay brothers. Father Laborius Schaefermeyer, former diocesan priest and vicar general of the Alton Diocese, now Springfield, before he joined the Franciscans, was the first pastor. With the coming of the Franciscans, St. Peter's took on a new role. Even though the parish was diminishing in numbers because of the freight depots, warehouses, and wholesale houses moving into the area, St. Peter's became a dynamic spiritual symbol. Chicago Catholics beat a path to the church and to its confessionals. Travelers came in great numbers from the railroad terminals, and visitors staying in the downtown hotels found their way to its doors. There were priests on duty in the confessional and on call all day, every day of the week, from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. All St. Peter's was staffed by some larger-than-life friar priests and brothers, too many to name. The second pastor, Father Augustine Henseler, succeeded in making St. Peter's one of the most beautiful churches in Chicago and created the traditional spirit of St. Peter's, the spirit of service to all in quest of spiritual comfort, especially in the confessional. Father Pat Maloney, during and after the Depression, was famous for his work among homeless teenage orphan boys in the jail. He created housing units for over 500 young men, fed and clothed them, and gave them part-time jobs. Father Pat died as a chaplain in the Second World War. The hundreds of bishops and priests who arrived into the city, sometimes as many as 50 a day, came to St. Peter's in between trains to celebrate Mass and were welcomed for breakfast by the lovable, amiable 6-foot friar, Brother Tim. Hospitality was and is still a hallmark of the friars at St. Peter's. Then there was the famous Brother Knut Dringler, who was St. Peter's doorkeeper for 40 years, who personified St. Peter's characteristic spirit of service. He was also St. Peter's bookkeeper, collected money for the Holy Land, and met every transient homeless in distress with uncommon charity and patience and a word of comfort. During those years, he handed out thousands of tickets for food and lodging. He suffered from foot and leg sores for years, but no one knew this because he never complained. His sleeping and eating were always interrupted by the doorbell. The friars of Old St. Peter's organized many spiritual groups and activities, such as the Layman's Retreat League, the Pious Union of St. Joseph for the Dying, the Friars' Legion begun in 1952, the Friars' Forum, a court of the Catholic Order of Foresters, St. Vincent de Paul Society, the Confraternity of the Most Precious Blood, which enrolled over 1,300 members in 1886, to name only a few. The friars were also chaplains at Cook County Jail, confessors at Mercy Hospital, chaplains to the Christian Brothers at De La Salle High School, and gave days of recollection and retreats to all kinds of groups. Notable among them was the Third Order of St. Francis, today known as Secular Franciscans. The energetic friar, Father Ulrich Petri, labored so successfully in this area that at the time of his death, St. Francis Fraternity numbered over 1,700 members and St. Louis Fraternity over 2,000. These tertiaries, as they were known, made altar linens and vestments for the missions, raised money for the missions, established a credit union, organized pilgrimages, had a 2,000-volume circulating library, and created financial aid scholarships for poor students studying for the Franciscan priesthood. The St. Francis Shrine and the Franciscan panels depicting the life of St. Francis in the present St. Peter's Church are gifts made possible by the secular Franciscans. Two of the young Third Order members, known as the Antonians, John Fardy, who died at Okinawa, and Joseph Ullman, who died at Guadalcanal, were both posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. For many years, it was evident that Old St. Peter's needed to move to a more advantageous spot and build a new church. Most of the parishioners had moved, and the area was becoming more industrial. In July of 1942, the Franciscans purchased the Woods Theater building on Randolph and Dearborn. Father Terence Thomas, who was pastor of the Franciscan parish in Dubuque, Iowa, was placed in charge of the building to map out its conversion into a church and a friary. The architect hired by the Franciscans took one look at the building and said, "Father, I think the Franciscans bought a lemon." Yet in spite of this, plans went forward to remodel the building. The plans were not ideal, and the building, 30 years old, but the provincial would hear of no other move. The Second World War was in progress, and building material was not available. Father Terence concluded that the Woods Theater building needed to be sold and a completely new building created and more centrally located. 6 years went by without any action. Father Terence proposed to the new provincial the purchase of a new site. The provincial bought the idea. The Woods building was sold and the LaSalle Theater building was bought. During the spring of 1950, the old LaSalle building at 110 West Madison was demolished and the lot was prepared for the erection of a new building. It was thought the project might be able to be completed in 16 months, but difficulties were encountered with the ground during the process of pile driving. About 640 pilings were driven into the ground, 70 feet down to hard pan. On these pilings, the entire building rests. A severe winter that year, and one unexpected obstacle after another arose. Finally, after 2 years, the Franciscans moved in, and St. Peter's was born. The realization of a vision, thanks to the persistence and hard work of Father Thomas, who became the first pastor of the new St. Peter's. On August 2nd, 1953, the church was dedicated and service began. The most striking part of the facade of the church is the gigantic, impressive, and inspiring crucifix, provoking countless photographs from visitors around the world. The architects designed a crucifix so heroic in size that no one would pass by without being struck in one's tracks and perhaps inspired to enter the church to pray and seek spiritual comfort. One does not often see such a bold religious proclamation in the midst of the secular skyscrapers of any city. From rough blocks of Georgia pink Etowa marble, Mr. J. Watts, with 2 assistants, sculptured the 18-foot, 26-ton figure of Christ, and by the use of pneumatic hammers, Mr. Watts finished the crucifix in 4 months, what would have taken 18 months if chiseled by hand. Mr. Watts, sculptor of national renown, is also the creator of Chicago's famous Buckingham Fountain in Grant Park. This unusual crucifix, portraying the drawn face and the strained muscles of Christ, are those of a man in agony. As one little girl visiting the workshop during that summer to watch the sculpture said to her mother in a whisper, "Isn't he a big God?" The new St. Peter's were built to accommodate 1,250 people on the main floor and 250 in the balcony. The pinkish tan Minnesota marble walls, the pink Tennessee marble floors, and the colorful rose windows give the church a glowing warmth. The best sculptors of Italy were employed of the cutting and polishing of the cream-colored Botticino artwork in the simple, imposing high altar with its white Carrara marble crucifix group and the statues of Saints Peter and Paul. The 10 Botticino marble panels depicting the life of St. Francis artistically take the place of art glass windows in the nave. Along the side aisles are 6 shrines and 14 confessionals. On the top of 3 floors of the building are the living quarters of the 25 Franciscans who presently live at St. Peter's. In the deep canyons formed by tall stone and glass buildings in Chicago's Loop stands the new St. Peter's, an oasis of spiritual and life-giving spirituality for all peoples. God alone knows how many people have passed through its doors, knelt in penance in the confessional, have prayed before the tabernacle or before all the shrines, and have received Holy Communion in all those years.